The philosopher Plotinus once complained that Gnostics don't have a treatise on virtue and have altogether left out the treatments of these subjects. Yet, when one examines their writings, some of them include substantive reflections on virtue. The author of the Gospel of Truth halts his metaphysical musings to offer this ethical exhortation: Speak the truth with those who seek it, and knowledge with those who have sinned in their error. Steady the feet of those who stumble, and extend your hands to the sick. Feed the hungry, and give rest to the weary. Awaken those who wish to arise, and rouse those who sleep. Do the Father's will, for you are from him. These aren't just figurative commands. They involve actual practice. Of course, rousing those who sleep may mean little more than telling people the Gnostic message. But as one tells this message, one can literally feed the hungry and help the sick. The Gnostic does not respond to people's physical needs solely with spiritual advice. Spiritual and ethical concerns are two sides of the same coin. I'm Dr. David Litwa, and on this channel, we explore Gnostic studies, the Greco-Roman world, and early Christianity. I want to invite all of you to subscribe for free to the Gnostic Archive, my online database useful for keeping you up to date with Gnostic studies and in early Christianity more broadly. For advanced students, join me in the Gnosis Academy, which includes a monthly hangout over Zoom, along with what are now 6 full online courses, including my introduction to Marcion and full introductions to nearly every text in the Nag Hammadi library. See the links in the description. The Sacred Book of John depicts salvation as a process of moral purification. One needs to be morally worthy to enter the great lights. Quote, "Those upon whom the Spirit of life descends," says Christ, "will be saved and become perfect, and they will be worthy to enter those realms of the great lights. For they will be worthy to be purified there from all evil and the enticements of wickedness, for they do not give themselves to anything else except this incorruptible congregation, and they attend to it without anger, or envy, or fear, or desire, or overindulgence." This is a state of calm in which people are not affected by anything except the state of being in the flesh alone. The life of the redeemed is not easy. It's a moral contest against the flesh and the counterfeit spirit, which requires maximum endurance. Ancient Gnostics may not have written a treatise on virtue, but they were opponents of vice, and they understood that vice begins as a negative emotion. So in the dialogue of the Savior, Judas asks Jesus, "What is the beginning of the way?" And Jesus answers, "Love and goodness." And at the end of the work, Jesus urges, it is the responsibility of whoever has come to know the works to do the will of the Father. As for you, work hard to rid yourselves of anger and jealousy. In another Nag Hammadi text, we are told, quote, "Avoid evil lusts and desires and whatever deviates from who you are." The Nag Hammadi library also contains 2 large-scale stories of the soul, the authoritative discourse and the exegesis of the soul. These stories are in themselves ethical dramas and roadmaps for individual souls. They expect the implied reader to identify with the soul and thus to take part in the narrative. The soul's journey is inherently ethical. Gnostic ethics focuses on detachment, on peeling away the soul from its material substrate. The soul's story is an exhortation to participate in purifying practice, to follow the path of virtue so that it can reascend to its original station. Furthermore, the Nag Hammadi library contains 2 sayings collections that are essentially ethical in nature, namely the sentences of Sextus and the teachings of Silvanus. These treatises are generally not considered Gnostic by scholars, but there must have been a reason why they found their way into a collection of Gnostic books. The sentences of Sextus consist of a series of maxims, most of them straightforwardly ethical, such as what we find here. A wise person is one who does what is good after God. It is better to serve others than to make others serve you. If you care for orphans, you will be a parent of many children and God's loved one. Do what is right to do, willingly. The opening lines of the teachings of Valentinus declare, "Strengthen your struggle against every kind of foolishness, consisting of the passions of erotic love, base wickedness, love of praise, fondness for strife, tiresome jealousy, wrath, anger, and avaricious desire." Later, the author remarks, quote, "The one who makes himself like God is someone who does nothing unworthy of God." Even if these writings don't qualify as Gnostic treatises on virtue, the point of reading them is obviously to learn virtue and to practice it. Despite the witness of Nag Hammadi, it's still a common rhetorical move to relegate Gnostics to the extremes. People depict Gnostics as either radical ascetics or abandoned libertines. They either punish the body unduly or let its desires run wild. They are antinomian, which is to say, against the laws, both human and divine. They are rebels to the core. Now, there's some truth to the assertion that Gnostics are transgressive, but they were not transgressors, actual criminals and profligates. They lived by a higher unwritten code, and so were prepared to relativize all human laws. They criticized laws found in Jewish scripture, since they considered the source of these laws either to be human or to be a middle management archon. Gnostics envisioned new worlds. They sought to rise above this world system, above the very stars. At the same time, they recognized that resisting the rule of the archons is only something one does down here. Gnostics recognized that ultimately this world is infinitesimally small and insignificant compared to the divine fullness. To the true God, at least, Gnostics are not rebels. And down below, they're not typically lawbreakers either. In fact, they live lives of virtue, including civic virtues like justice and peace. Sethians, for instance, imagine themselves as persons intimately linked with the establishment of truth and justice. They understood themselves as couriers of the providential spirit that worked toward the rectification of deficiency. They were fruit-bearing trees, the holy people of the great light coming into the world to illuminate the whole realm. Gnostics were also conscious of sin, which they acknowledged and struggled to overcome. According to one Valentinian sermon, quote, "If we sin, who are the fighters of the word, we sin worse than the Gentiles, but if we overcome all sin, we shall receive the crown of victory." Sin was a problem for Valentinians because it excluded them from the life in the fullness. The Father only rewards those who follow his will. Gnosis from the Father removed the power of sin, making Gnostics free from it in theory. But in practice, they worked hard not to transgress. They experienced God's unmerited grace, yet their actual behavior still mattered. Anti-heresy writers constantly issued vague and unproven charges of mostly sexual immorality against their opponents, but they mostly recycled charges flung at all Christians by outsiders. All Christians reportedly had group orgies and sacrificed babies. These kinds of charges continually crop up when outsiders try to depict often new religious movements as utterly perverse and foreign to society's values. Perhaps there were Gnostics who had indiscriminate group orgies and, in their cupped hands, slurped down their own semen and menses. But other groups, such as the Mandaeans and Manichaeans, were wrongfully accused of this practice. Our source for the semen-eating ritual is Epiphanius, and he had no direct experience of the rite itself. And other Gnostic texts condemn the practice, whether it actually happened or not. Heresiology is a form of yellow journalism, and no matter how many times a charge is repeated, such as the Christians started the fire in Rome, there are secret communists in Congress, and Democrats eat babies, it does not make any of them true. If we really believed the heresiologists, we would have to imagine many Gnostics as sex maniacs. But when we actually look at the Gnostic texts from Nag Hammadi and elsewhere, we see the opposite tendency: writers who are opposed to sex because they want to live according to a higher morality. And this was generally acknowledged in ancient Mediterranean culture. A person who refrained from sex was viewed as more self controlled. Since self control was a virtue in that culture, refraining from sex was lauded by most Christians. This same attitude explains priestly and monastic vows among Roman Catholics today. Generally speaking, heresy writers weren't threatened because Gnostics fell below common moral standards, but because they determined to live above them. Marcion, for instance, required all baptized members of his church to commit to celibacy. Julius Cassianus, said to be a former Valentinian, recommended a spiritual practice of castration, cutting off both sex and sexual desire. And he was not alone. Isidore, son of Basilides, understood Jesus to be recommending celibacy when he praised eunuchs for the kingdom. Abstaining from sex is a demand in the Book of Thomas, the Testimony of Truth, and the Paraphrase of Shem, among other ancient Gnostic texts. The motivation for a stricter sexual morality is not, or not primarily, to spite the Creator who said, "Be fruitful and multiply." It seems rather that Gnostics were concerned with defilement. Defilement is a kind of bad mixture. Sexual thoughts, when mixed with spiritual contemplation, or even normal rational cognition, are distracting. One can't solve a math problem and fantasize at exactly the same moment, let alone contemplate the spiritual world. Sexual fulfillment rivets one's mind to the flesh and its concerns. Sex is something that animals do. Dogs, for instance, can't seem to help themselves from humping an attractive member of their own species. Yet who can blame them? Sexual pleasure is arguably the most profound bodily pleasure, and it's easy to be overwhelmed by it, such that people live for sex and in their thoughts rise no higher than the beasts. And finally, sex expresses a lack or deficiency. Human bodies wither and perish, so people reproduce themselves to keep the species alive. According to the authoritative discourse, quote, "The body came from lust, and lust came from material substance." Once people exit their material platforms, death won't be a problem, and sex will become unnecessary. In antiquity, Gnostics dared to recognize their spiritual and immortal identities in their present, and to find a way in their biological lives to overcome fleshly desire. The rejection of sex among Gnostics did not necessarily imply the rejection of family. Gnostics, like many Christians, sought fictive kin connected by a common spirit rather than by common blood. Some Gnostics were married, but chose to renounce sex in marriage. Other Gnostics, like the Valentinians, sacralized marriage and arguably made it into a sacrament. Sexual union imitated the spiritual unions of eternal beings above. But there was an impure and a pure way to perform sex. Sex driven by lust and focused on the flesh is impure. Sex performed by an act of will, with a consciousness raised to higher reality, is pure and results in the production of spiritual children. Some groups, such as the Valentinians, understood eating meat sacrificed to Greco-Roman gods as a matter of moral indifference. In taking this position, they had a precedent in Paul. According to the apostle, an idol is nothing. Thus, Christians could attend a dinner party and eat meat that had been sacrificed to idols. There is nothing ontologically different about the meat sacrificed to a Greco-Roman god. It remains meat, and it can be eaten as long as one does not ask questions about its source. Christians can even eat meat in another god's temple. The only way to go wrong, really, is to offend the conscience of another Christian. But those in the know ought not to be offended by food and drink. To be sure, Irenaeus was bothered that Valentinians attended the festivals of Greco-Roman gods. Presumably, Valentinians did not attend these events in order to worship these gods, or because they believed that they were real. Gods were connected to cities, and so one could attend a festival out of civic pride, not from religious devotion. Perhaps Valentinians wanted to avoid being accused of misanthropy, the social isolation which made people seem to look down on others. Or perhaps they just wanted some free meat. Living indifferently does not mean that Gnostics checked out from life. Few Gnostics became monastics. Most ancient Gnostics dwelled in urban jungles where ideas flowed most freely. They were in the world, though not of it. Indifference is an attitude of non investment, of detachment. It's a manifestation of calm, of emotional stability in a world buzzing with hucksters and hawkers of goods, in a world quivering with anxiety, diseased by poverty, or shattered by war. The view that some things, such as growing a beard or wearing shoes, are morally indifferent was often twisted into moral relativism. All acts are good or bad, not by nature, but by human choice. Yet Valentinians, for their part, believed firmly in divine virtues like faith, hope, and love, virtues which appear as eternal beings or aeons in the Valentinian systems. Violent emotions like fear, confusion, and grief are genuine evils. They were called passions or illnesses, and Valentinians supported a version of Jesus who healed these passions. If Jesus could heal the passions of wisdom, then he could heal wisdom's children as well. The Carpocratian Jesus, according to Irenaeus' own report, fully disabled his passions. It is true that he did so in part by despising Jewish customs, but this does not mean that he was antinomian in principle or that Carpocratians genuinely represented radical antinomianism. Most Christians discounted Jewish laws like circumcision and refraining from physical work on the Sabbath. By virtue of despising these laws, Jesus received patently moral powers by which he disabled his passions. Jesus not only controlled his passions, he uprooted them like a Stoic sage. In this way, Jesus became the ultimate philosopher. But he was more than a philosopher. According to Valentinus, Jesus had such a power of self control that it changed the very nature of his body. His intestines did not produce corruption, and so Jesus did not produce waste. According to Plato, true philosophers keep away from all bodily passions, master them, and do not surrender themselves to them. Mastery of the passions results in living a just life. We can infer that Jesus' mastery of the passions is what made him just. The Carpocratian Jesus was one of the very few who maintained absolute purity and justice. His soul was not sent here for punishment or purification. He was already pure and overcame his passions to manifest the kind of life that Christians were meant to imitate. Obviously, there were Gnostics who questioned the validity of individual laws. Epiphanes, son of Carpocrates, argued that sex and sexual desire was good by nature. It was God's way of promoting reproduction in the animal kingdom. Therefore, Epiphanes recommended a system in which wives were not held as a man's personal possession. Men and women should be free to desire and to have intercourse with any whom they please. Epiphanes thus criticized the 10th commandment of the Mosaic law, do not desire your neighbor's wife, because it assumed that the neighbor had private ownership of his wife. If a law was truly divine, it would not assume the unjust system of private ownership. Thus Moses, at least in this case, must have been joking. Now, recommending a non-monogamous system of marriage was indeed radically opposed to Greco-Roman values and traditions. Still, it would be hasty to conclude that Carpocratians as a whole dissolved individual marriage and made up the world's first free love movement. We don't know this. All we have is the theoretical musings of a 17-year-old Christian philosopher, namely Epiphanes, who made certain recommendations about sexual congress as a consequence of his general theory that people, Christian or not, ought not to hold private property. Did Carpocratians actually implement a free love movement like the hippies in the 1960s? It seems not. Carpocrates had a wife named Alexandria, and it's never said that he divorced or shared her. Marcellina, leader of a Carpocratian group in Rome, did not practice any system in which women or wives were common. If she made herself common to other men, heresiologists would surely have taken notice. In effect, Epiphanes was no more libertine than Plato or Zeno the Stoic. These philosophers published books recommending marriage, that is, intercourse, with multiple women who were not permanently given to one man. These philosophical thought experiments gave people food for thought, encouraging them to think in new ways. As individuals, Plato and Zeno were never charged with immorality, even though many people mocked their wives in common proposal. Outsiders accused Christians as a whole, not Carpocratians specifically, of holding their wives in common. But no one takes this charge seriously when it is flung against the proto-Orthodox. There's a double standard here. Irenaeus himself could barely believe that Carpocratians do the very things he ascribed to them. Notably, there is Irenaeus' charge against Carpocratians that their souls experience every employment of life, so that on departing this life, these souls lack nothing. They must work for this, since if something is lacking to their freedom, they are forced again to be sent into a body. It is true that among later heresiologists, performing every work or employment also included every work of sin, but Irenaeus, their source, does not say this. To accomplish every employment of life may have meant little more than attaining the widest breadth of earthly experience. In Platonic thinking, it took multiple lives to train the soul for heaven. Philosophic souls required at least 3 embodiments, and wayward souls needed dozens, if not hundreds more. If, within the space of a single life, one could learn and transcend all forms of bodily life, one could take the fast track to heaven and, like Jesus, avoid reincarnation after the first trial. There was a Hermetic saying, perhaps current in Carpocrates' time: having supposed that nothing is impossible to you, consider yourself deathless and able to understand everything, all art, all science, the character of every living thing, times, places, things, qualities, quantities. In this line of thought, to experience every employment of life is a work of the imagination. One cannot literally perform every job on earth by being active in every time and place, but one can understand different forms of life. It was the job of the intellect to understand all arts. The Hermetic ethical goal was, at any rate, similar to the Carpocratian one: to transcend bodily life altogether by avoiding reincarnation. Given that Carpocratians aim to imitate the passionless and just Jesus, performing every sin seems out of place. And we should note also the evidence from Clement, who describes the views of his opponents on transmigration, quote, "For they lead down the divine soul into the present cosmos, as if into a place of punishment, since it is fitting in their view for these souls to be purified in embodied vessels." Clement did not explicitly mention Carpocratians in this passage, though in this case we can reasonably suspect that they were included in his macro category of those who credit transmigration. If so, then Carpocratians also taught transmigration as a system of purification, and this Pythagorean model makes sense since Carpocratians endeavored to imitate a pure and just Jesus. Irenaeus writes that the one who obtains Valentinian redemption gets puffed up to such an extent that he thinks he's neither in heaven nor on earth, but he has entered the fullness and is already in the embrace of his angel. He struts about with arrogance and pride and has the air of a proud rooster. There are those among them who assert that good conduct is necessary for them to receive the human who descends from on high, and because of this, with a certain pride, they feign dignity, but many of them, having become scoffers, as if they are already perfect, live irreverently and contemptuously. They call themselves spirituals and assert that they already know the place of refreshment, which is in their fullness. It is indeed traditional for heresy writers to accuse their enemies of spiritual pride. But one of the pervasive themes in the Nag Hammadi writings is the criticism of this very vice. Yaldabaoth, that boastful archon, comes in for the biggest reproach. He is simply called the arrogant one. His lack of gnosis explains his pride. He supposes that he's the greatest power because he has no true understanding of the spirit realm, filled with angels, aeons, and powers above him, not to mention his mother, wisdom, and the supreme God. People truly in the know, that is, Gnostics, understand that they are but specks in a greater fullness and droplets in the deep. They acknowledge that heaven has many layers, although they may claim spiritual superiority over airy archons and planetary powers. They still recognize their subordinate position to spirit beings like angels, gods, powers, aeons, and of course, to the infinite God. Learning that God is too great to be known is, in itself, an exercise in humility. Gnostics did care about virtue, and the queen of Gnostic virtues is humility. True Gnosis, with all due respect to Paul, does not puff up. Rather, true Gnosis shows how much humans don't know. True Gnosis identifies the knower and the known. It unites people with God. Gnosis is a form of knowledge, but that knowledge does not give control over the object of knowledge. Knowledge makes one aware of the vastness of one's ignorance, and ignorance ever runs ahead of knowledge. Gnosis is also an unknowing, and those who recognize that they know virtually nothing are in a better position to know anything. Arguably, Gnostics don't actually know more than anyone else. They are simply awake to what they already know, and so remember it. The world is not split between the ignorant and the elite, but between people who think they know and those who know that they don't know. Indeed, Gnostics know that they cannot know the greatest of realities. They knew the story of wisdom's transgression. She tried to know the Father by herself and failed. Gnostics learn not to transgress, not to go beyond what can be known. They humbly accept an infinite deep as their source, the overwhelming fullness. To find refreshment in the fullness is not pride, but an act of self-sacrifice, for the ego and the ego self are submerged in the divine ocean. To quote the Valentinian tripartite tractate, the end will regain the form of existence of a single one, just as the beginning was a single one.